Started. So we're really thrilled to have Radhika Desai here with us today. Radhika's contributions as a scholar and public intellectual are monumental, and she is a real beacon of clarity and integrity, particularly when it comes to understanding our contemporary world. Radhika is professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. She is also the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, the convener of the International Manifesto Group, past president of the Society for Socialist Studies, the vice president of the World Association for Political Economy, and the deputy editor of World Marxist Review. She has produced an incredible and varied range of work on the topics of party politics, political and geopolitical economy, political and economic theory, nationalism, fascism, and British, US, and Indian politics. She is the author of many important books and articles. Most recently, she published Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy, and we read the introduction for today's session. She is also the author of Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, Slouching Towards Ayodhya, From Congress to Hindutva in Indian Politics, and Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labor Party. So we're going to start. First, I know that Radhika has some thoughts to share about the previous session, so we wanted to start with that.
Yeah, I just thought I would say a couple of things, because oddly you might think that this wonderful presentation, which was so much about philosophy and philosophy of science and what have you, and what could that possibly have to do with the subjects that we are going to discuss in my session. But in fact there are connections, so one of the questions that arose, sorry, where is Zayad? Okay. One of the questions that arose in the discussion is, the relationship between science and capitalism. And while there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that one of the things that propelled the development of modern science in the early days of, say, the Enlightenment and so on, was the emergence of a capitalist class, because that gave people who wish to challenge the authority, say, of the church or of the aristocracy, etc., some kind of social base from which to do so. So there were, definitely there is a deep connection between the development of capitalism and the development of modern science. But of course that doesn't mean that this is necessarily an unmitigated good, that this makes capitalism wonderful, because of course as it developed, capitalism also, I think the young lady here, you were asking a very interesting question about, how capitalism gives to science a certain analytical character, where you sort of break things apart and you sort of analyze them for instrumental reasons, because your purpose in intervening with nature is to use it instrumentally, not to work with it, but against it, to dominate it, and so on. And I think that gives the kind of science that is produced under capitalism a certain character. But there's a third thing that I want to say, which is to me the most interesting. So this comes out of the fact that, earlier this year we had the big release of DeepSeek and all the convulsions that it caused. And, I've just finished a paper, which will be published very soon, in which I use as an epigraph Marx's classic statement in the 1859 preface that, at a certain point in the development of societies, what is it exactly, how does it go? About social productive forces, relations of production initially advance the development of the social productive forces, and then they act as a fetter on it. So since basically, if you ask me, the late 19th century in particular, science has become particularly complicit with monopoly capitalism in the most destructive ways possible, which is why we get science, which is, which can produce nuclear bombs, which can produce the, ultra-processed foods, produce all sorts of drugs which are not particularly necessary and which we are invited to take all the time, etc. So, you get all of these things, but you're now at a point in time where I feel that the ability of capitalism to develop the forces of production is also, it's basically exhausted. And you can see that socialism Chinese socialism, socialism in China, whatever you may think of it, whether you think it's fully socialist or not doesn't matter, but a society organized on a socialist basis can produce much better science. So I just wanted to say that, so really we are living at a point where we can say truly that and this is very important and interesting because most people associate capitalism with innovation, the development of science, etc. But of course, this is not just true in the case of the PRC. People will remember, when DeepSeek was released, somebody, Mark Andreessen, this tech bro, called it a Sputnik moment. But actually, it was worse than Sputnik. Because when the Soviets launched the first satellite, the United States didn't even have a space program, right? And then they, NASA was created, and then NASA was told that, you are going to make landing a man on the moon the big thing, and man on the moon was just a stunt. It was a stunt. Today's satellites still remain one of the most useful things that human beings could evolve. What is the point of landing a human being on the moon? There never was one. And in fact, one of the curators of the Science and Technology Museum actually essentially called it a stunt. But anyway, let's not go there. But my point is that, capitalism can no longer be associated with the development of the forces of production. What Marx said, which is that ultimately the relations of private property would be a fetter on the development of science, will come true. So I thought I'd say that. And the second thing is just a very short and a joke, really. But all this discussion about exactly, what counts as philosophy made me, and all the different things we call philosophy reminded me of a joke. So there are these two ladies standing at a station. They are just gossiping away. And one of them is belly aching to the other about all her troubles, one after another, this is going wrong, that's going wrong. So after she's finished, her friend takes a deep sigh and says, "Oh, well, dear, just be very philosophical about it and don't give it another thought." Philosophy is also mindlessness.
Well, let's. The first question we wanted to ask you is if you could please explain the meaning and significance of multipolarity and our current conjuncture, and how multipolarity is related to the struggle against imperialism, and how it is related to socialist construction.
Okay, wow, that is, you really, I think, like Zayad, I have to keep probably saying, oh, this is such a big question, because you're asking really huge questions. And but it is a very pertinent question, so let me first of all say that one of the ways in which, let me start again. In 2013, I proposed geopolitical economy as a way of trying to understand the international relations of capitalism. But I didn't just sort of pull it out of a hat like a rabbit. I mean, to me, this is the Marxist way of understanding international relations. And again, and of course, I didn't want to find a Marxist way because I have a thing about Marx. I wanted to find a Marxist way because I think Marx's and Engels' ideas and analysis of capitalism still remains the most powerful analysis. So to me, developing the implications of what they said about the international relations of capitalism is still the surest way of making an advance. In doing this, I found that Marx and Engels paid a lot of attention to the role of the state. Contrary to what people imagine, some people say Marx and Engels never had a theory of the state. That's actually not true. So they paid a lot of attention to that, and there is, and although Marx never, Marx had a plan for Capital which was going to span some 6 to 8 volumes, but he never finished that. And one of those volumes was definitely going to be about world trade. And had he written that volume, we would have understood Marx in a very different way, because most people think that Marx, that they associate Marx with a free trade view of the world. Yeah, and of course later on some people have tried to appropriate Marx for an understanding of how international relations function for theories of US hegemony.
But in the process of writing my book, I realized that 19th century free trade ideas, 20th century globalization ideas, 21st century US empire and hegemony ideas, these are all forms of cosmopolitan thinking which Marx would have criticized. Okay? Because Marx did not think that the whole world economy or the world economy is a seamless whole in which nations don't matter, either because the world economy is united by markets or because the world economy is united by just one state. Marx would have totally understood that the world economy is divided into nation states and national economies, and that under capitalism it cannot be otherwise. That is to say, there is something very deeply interconnected about capitalism and the nation state system. That's the first point. Second point is that, of course, Marx was very serious. Contrary to a lot of what passes for Marxist economics and Western Marxism, Marx insisted that capitalism is riddled with contradictions, which regularly lead to crises. And in fact, as I say, I don't know where I say it in Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, whether it was in the introduction or elsewhere, but basically I point out that, if it wasn't for capitalist states constantly intervening in capitalist crisis to restabilize capitalism and continue it, capitalism would have basically stopped existing after maybe a decade or two at most. So the longevity of capitalism is a political phenomenon. It is organized by states. And this is a point to which we can come back. But because capitalism is contradictory, states manage these contradictions by doing through a range of options, which we can divide into two. One is they can take various domestic actions, so they can regulate capitalism domestically, they can make concessions to working people, etc., regulate capitalism and so on. And they can take international actions. They can try to externalize the consequences of the contradictions of capitalism. It's basically what we call imperialism. And then I discovered that Marx also points out in a very pregnant discussion of the work of the American mercantilist theorist Henry Carey. Marx totally recognizes that free trade is not the normal state of capitalism, that once you have the dominance of one country in the world economy, at that time it was Britain, then other countries are bound to undertake protectionist forms of what I call combined development or state-directed development. Okay, that's what the United States did under Hamilton, that's what Germany did, that's what Japan did. Every successful form of capitalism has been state-directed. And so there is this dialectic in a certain sense of imperialism and anti-imperialism. And essentially this is what uneven and combined development is about. So Trotsky later on dubbed this uneven and combined development. By the way, I have some Russian friends who know this term and they often call it uneven and mixed development. But anyway, the word combined, even Trotsky said, I can't think of a better word, so I'm going to call it combined. But in Russian, whatever word he used can also be translated as mixed. Anyway, so he talked about uneven and combined development, but people, in Marxists, they tend to either not talk about uneven and combined development at all, assuming that capitalism is this, either taking a globalization or free trade approach or a US empire approach. So the whole world economy is united and the existence of a multitude of states does not matter. Or if they talk about it, they only talk about uneven development. I can think of some geographers who do that, because that means that, essentially the existing structure of imperialism is eternal. And there is also a tendency among Marxists to show how radical they are by saying, oh, imperialism today is even worse than it ever was. That's not true. And there lies the rub. Imperialism today is weaker than it has ever been. And that's thanks to uneven and combined development, thanks to the fact that initially you had a first phase of combined development in which the states that developed were capitalist states, and they could be capitalist states because there was still room to extend imperialism. So that was the big burst of capitalist development at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which led to imperialist competition, and the imperialist competition led to the First World War and the 30 Years crisis that it inaugurated. So this is the first phase was capitalist, but after 1914, the only states, apart from exceptions like South Korea or the province of Taiwan, the only reasonably successful forms of development have had to be socialist. The Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, China, etc. So you have some other countries as well, India, Mexico, Brazil, etc. They are all vaguely developed to some extent, but it's not, the development is not as robust as what you saw under the Soviet Union or today under the PRC. So, so there's a new form of combined development which necessarily has to be socialist. We can talk more about that. So to me, this dialectic of uneven and combined development has led, notwithstanding the power of imperialist countries, to spread productive power around the world more widely. This is a process that has weakened the power of imperialist countries. Today, what we find is that the ability of the United States to control what happens in the world is lower than ever. And a lot of the militarism that we see is a kind of is essentially like a tantrum on the part of the United States, because it is both furious and impotent at the same time, okay, because they cannot change the world. They have not been able to change anything, and we can discuss that as well if you want. So to me, so to come back to your question, what is the significance of multipolarity is that, and Marx says in his discussion of Carey, that this dialectic is essentially the manifestation of the contradictions of capitalism on the international plane, which he calls the grandest terrain on which these contradictions appear, where they appear in their grandest development. So this is essentially the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism. It is fundamentally about development, because it's about developing society's productive forces, which is what we have seen in the Soviet Union and China, and hopefully, and the more productive capacity spreads, the easier it will become for other countries to emulate that process, so that you will have, you know, we will go from a very tall hierarchy of countries, we will go to a flatter and flatter. What multipolarity does is it flattens the differences between the distance between the advanced countries and the not advanced countries. So as this process develops, you will see a melting away of imperialism. And of course, if we are right that capitalism and imperialism are, you know, they cannot do without one another. Capitalism cannot do without imperialism. Then the more its imperial power wanes, the more capitalism will also wane, because it will lose options. It will exhaust its options, right? So in this sense, I think that therefore, and I should add here that the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group that Jennifer mentioned, if you have time to read just one article, it's about article length, about 8,000 words, please read it. But we see socialism as emerging not just as a kind of result of the eruption of class forces, sort of somehow in one loud thunderclap all over the world, but rather as a result of a combination of class and national forces, where in different countries, depending on domestic circumstances, there will be revolutions, and then they will proceed towards socialism. And the more countries that are socialist already, the more easier it will be for other countries to be socialist. So there will be a kind of different countries will develop towards socialism, each at their own pace, each in their own way. But eventually the result will be advanced towards some form of socialism. I think I'll end here. I have a couple more things to say, but I'm sure you'll give me an opportunity to say more things.
I think I'll take it from here. Thank you so much, Radhika. I really appreciated your opening comments as well about the ways in which in the capitalist world it's the relations of production, meaning the private ownership over the means of production, that fetter its productive capacity, and that you see that very clearly in science and technology. And there are many, many examples, and all of the advances being made, not only in the kind of technological sciences, but also in the medical sciences and in other fields, is related as well to the socialization of knowledge. And so we should be able to perceive that in the overall project, and it's a very important element that you've highlighted. I did want to shift, though, to a question that is more germane to what you just highlighted, and that is one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that you have been a public intellectual who is intervening to provide a general framework for understanding contemporary geopolitics, which is shifting very quickly, and there's a need to kind of reorient a lot of the assumptions on the part of the Western left intelligentsia, but the intelligentsia more broadly. And one of the conundrums that one often encounters is that the powers that are rising in this multipolar world, and in particular the socialist leadership, like the case of China, are often denigrated as doing the exact same thing as the capitalist forces, and potentially just being state capitalist, or on top of that even being imperialist. And that argument is marshaled in particular concerning China and Russia. Now, these, of course, are different countries, right, as far as, I mean, not only that, but they have different socioeconomic systems. But how do you respond to the criticism that Russia and China are just imperialist countries?
Yeah, okay, another really important question. So, first of all, let me just say very briefly that the way I tackle the question of, people say, well, China isn't socialist, it's just capitalist. Look at, they have all these big capitalist enterprises, and that's true. But I would tackle the question of whether China is socialist at all in the following way. Yes, there's a lot of private enterprise in China. Yes, a lot of that private enterprise in China is very big and very powerful. There are big corporations in China. Yes, some of these big CEOs are quite influential. Many of them are even, they rub shoulders with upper level Politburo members and whatever, the highest levels of the Chinese leadership. All these things are true. But the difference is that in China, the state controls capital, including big corporate capital. If Jack Ma wants to have an IPO and the Communist Party state says that he shouldn't have it, he can't have it. Okay? In capitalist countries, and I'm thinking here in particular of the United States, but really any capitalist country will do, it is the corporate capitalist class that controls the state. And you are seeing that today in an ever bigger way, because the ability of the corporate capitalist class to allow their political representatives who are in government to even pretend to run the economy in the national interest is gone. I mean, today you can see that the powers that be in Washington or London are running the economy at the bidding of an ever smaller capitalist elite. And even sort of the next tiers of capitalists, or certainly small business, can go to hell. And that's partly why you have so many small business people also, standing behind people like Trump and so on. So anyway, that's the one point. China is socialist in this way. Can China be imperialist? Is China imperialist? Is Russia imperialist? So my first answer to that question is that, my argument in geopolitical economy was that, the United States never succeeded in let me rephrase that. Theories of US hegemony are not not theories of what's happening in the world. They are a US ambition given the dignity of a social scientific theory. Okay? And the US ambition has been there since the early 20th century. What was the ambition? The ambition was to replicate the kind of dominance that Britain once enjoyed in the world economy in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So they did in the 19th century, we'll do in the 20th century. Yes, we can't have an empire the size of which, the size of the British Empire, but you know what? It's fine. We don't need an empire. We'll simply make the dollar the world's money, and that's all we need. Except that, of course, two things were wrong with this. Number one, the world had already become multipolar, and the kind of dominance Britain once exercised could never again be exercised. Number two, sterling only worked because Britain had an empire. There is no way that the dollar could provide the world with a, even the kind of world money the kind of stable world money that sterling supplied. The dollar could never do that, and we can discuss that later. But so even the US could not be hegemonic in the same sense. And as the world becomes more multipolar, the ability of any country to exercise that kind of dominance over other countries is diminished. Okay, so even if China wanted, China could not be imperialist in the same sense. However, China also is not just China also comes from a certain historical experience. China has been at the receiving end of imperialism. So has Russia in many ways. And they have traditions of anti-imperialism. Russia may no longer be the Soviet Union, but there are senses in which that experience of having been in that position is not completely gone. It's there. It informs the foreign policy thinking of the Russian capitalist class. I'm not saying that these countries will never make mistakes, but I think that this combination of things will mean that there is absolutely no way that China or Russia will even attempt to be the kind of imperialist power that the US has attempted to be. And a final point I'd make is that if you want to see the difference between China's international posture versus the United States, or Russia's international posture versus the United States, just call up a map. First call up a map of all US foreign bases in the world. Next, call up a map of all Russian foreign bases in the world. And finally, call up a map of all Chinese foreign bases in the world, and you will see the difference. The US has some 800 plus foreign bases all over the world. They don't do, by the way, very much, but they are there, signifying the ambition of the United States. Not the realization of the ambition, but the ambition, the unrealized ambition. Which has the power to do a lot of destruction, but no construction of a world order subservient to US power. Russia and China have hardly any. Like, they have maybe a handful in their most immediate neighborhood. Okay, that's about it. So these are some of the ways in which I would say that and today, it's very difficult to be imperialist in the same sense. I mean, if the US cannot even win a war against Iran, which it did not, recently there was this big bust up. And suddenly you got the ceasefire. Why did you get a ceasefire? Because the United States realized that it dropped its biggest assets on Iran, dropped its biggest bombs on Iran, and they still did not succeed in achieving their aim, which was to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. And now, of course, they have ended up giving Iran a perfect cause, a perfect reason to say that they can and should be a nuclear power. Why? Because you think about it, Saddam Hussein never had nuclear weapons. That's why he suffered the fate he did. Libya gave up its ambitions to be a nuclear power, and look what happened to Gaddafi, etc. So, of course, North Korea has known that for a long time. That's why they insist on having nuclear weapons. So anyway, that's long-winded answer. Sorry.
No, I just want to kind of ask you a bit more about your analysis of Russia's place in the global geopolitical order, and also what do you make of the current state of the US's proxy war on Russia and Ukraine, and what is at stake in this conflict?
That's a really interesting question, and I would like to do a lot more reading on it than I have. But basically, it seems to me that as far as the capitalist West is concerned, Russia has always been too big. Yeah, and there have been fantasies of breaking it up for a long time. This goes back to Halford Mackinder's ideas about the heartland and theories and so on. It's because it's really about controlling Russia. And and Russia is big. I think thanks to a number of historical and geographical accidents, but that's just the way it is. Russia is, and you know, why is Russia too big for? Because these countries are capitalist countries, and what capitalist countries always want is to get their paws on resources and so on. So that's the first thing. And I would say that a lot more historical research can be done about the relationship specifically between Russia and the capitalist West. I think that would be quite interesting. Secondly, you see, I think that Russia in the world system, that is to say present-day post-communist Russia in the world system. So obviously it was the aim of the capitalist West to essentially integrate Russia into itself, into as a subordinated country. And the shock therapy that was administered on Russia with the end of communism really, it was probably the most destructive, you know, I think probably compared to, maybe that was before the current Greek crisis. They said the Greek crisis was really very bad on Greece, but certainly something extremely awful was visited on Russia in the 1990s, where in peacetime, longevity declined in a relatively prosperous society. I mean, Russia was, you know, in 1989, 1990, Russia had achieved levels of well-being that were, you know, not to be sneezed at. You know, they were comparable to the West. If not, you know, if not to the neoliberal lifestyles of certain Western elites, certainly comparable to middle-class lifestyles in Western countries. So that's what Russia had achieved, and no Russian who has experienced it will forget the 1990s and what happened to them during the 1990s, what they were reduced to in the 1990s. So, and I think that towards the end, and of course there's also the very critical matter from a security point of view, that Russia was given assurances, both verbally and in writing, that NATO would not, you know, when the Russians agreed to allow Germany to unify, that meant that a chunk of what had been in the Soviet sphere of influence, namely East Germany, would become part of NATO, right? So NATO was coming that much closer to Russia. And the Russians sought, Russians sought and were given assurances that NATO would not expand 1 inch beyond East Germany. But of course they did. By the end of the 1990s, you had the first phase of NATO expansion, and since that there have been several in which Russia has come constantly closer to NATO. This had already happened before Yeltsin left power, and Yeltsin was the one who nominated Putin as his successor. And what Putin was able to achieve domestically was that he was able to domestically stabilize Russia. But he still pursued a broadly neoliberal line. So, I would be very critical of that, obviously. But nevertheless, you know, that's the line he was pursuing. But nevertheless, that neoliberalism had to be modified already. Then you got the Ukraine crisis, 2014. And I think that since that time, or around that time, Putin was already beginning to realize that the West was going to try to manipulate him via various oligarchs within his system. So you will remember, I forget the exact years, but people like Berezovsky and others were essentially stopped from operating in Russia because they were regarded as pro-Western oligarchs. So Putin has been left with it. There's still an oligarchical system in Russia, but it is a system in which the state has some considerable control over those oligarchs. And then since the Ukraine crisis, beginning with the first sanctions in 2014 and then the intensification of sanctions after 2022, what you've seen is that per force, Russia has been forced to essentially become more of a developmental state, beginning with the defense industries, but also then extending elsewhere. So essentially what you have in Russia today is that there has been considerable import substituting industrialization because Western sanctions have stopped various Western imports. And quite frankly, I think that's a good thing. Like, why should Russians, when they have so much ability to create things for themselves, why should they be importing anything from anywhere? You know, whether it is luxury goods or cars and so on, they have the technological capacity to make all these things. You know, one of the reasons why Russian hackers and cyber attacks are so dreaded is because Russia has a huge population of highly trained IT professionals, but they can do a whole lot of things themselves. So anyway, the point is that it has become more and more of a developmental state. The neoliberal direction that Putin was going in, which, if you remember, in the mid-2010s, there were all these demonstrations against Putin and so on, because he was going to change the pension system and so on and so forth, to the detriment of ordinary people. So that has kind of gone away. More and more, Russia is becoming a lot more welfareist because, you know, they need to expand demand within Russia for Russian industries and so on. So all of these things have been good. And as far as the proxy war that the West is waging against Russia is concerned, they're losing. They are losing the war. There is, you know, and quite frankly, I think that the European elites, I mean, Putin already is kind of, Donald Trump is already kind of turning away from the Russian. I think what Donald Trump is waiting to see is, you know, how he can, you know, like essentially allow things to work out on their own, and depending on who wins, and I think obviously the Russians will win, he will wash his hands off Zelensky eventually. But the point is that the West, so it's the Europeans who are digging deeper and deeper and attaching themselves to the losing Ukrainian cause. And to me, there is absolutely no way that Western Europe can be secure with a hostile Russia on its borders. There's just no way they can be secure. So, and already, you know, and I've been waiting for this to happen, and finally I see that there are some elements. I think it was the grandson, must be the grandson of Willy Brandt, who has now come out in Germany as the spokesperson of the people who are saying we should not make an enemy of Russia. We should reinstate our energy relationship with Russia. We should engage with Russia and have dialogue with Russia, and so on. So this kind of and quite frankly, it will, you know, it can be popular as well, but I think it can also come from the capitalist classes, if they have any sense in Europe, that it doesn't make sense for us. You know, we cannot win against Russia. We cannot win in a war against Russia. Plus, we have a lot to gain from a good relationship. In fact, that's what someone like Merkel could see, which is why you got Nord Stream 1, which is why you got Nord Stream 2, and which is why you could not get this war until she was out of office. She went in the fall of 2021, and by the spring of 2022, you had this war. So that's, if I've missed anything, do come back, but yeah.
Yeah, you actually already start to address one of the next questions that we had, so I'll share it with everyone, but if you want to give a few additional elements, don't hesitate. So Putin himself was involved in the dismantling, of course, of the Soviet Union. He's been outspoken in his criticisms of and disagreements with Lenin and Leninism. Russia is also the subject of critiques of authoritarianism. So how do you respond to leftists who have those critiques? But just in the interest of time, I'll kind of fold that into the next question, which is you've done very important work on the rise of authoritarianism, right-wing extremism, fascism within the capitalist world. And in particular, you have a very good article, perhaps there's more than that, on the Modi regime and its relationship to this kind of global wave. What is it important to understand about the international character of contemporary fascism?
Okay, so on Putin, Lenin, etc., you know, I think that I will also say that I should probably do a lot more research on this than I have done. But let me tell you what I do know for now. Putin's criticisms of, so obviously there is a certain allergy to talking about socialism today. So I have Russian friends who will describe the kind of society that they wish to create, which I would call socialist, but they will call something else. Okay, so because, you know, and there is a sense that, you know, the socialist experiment was too costly for Russia. And I can see why they say that, but I would say again that this also comes from a misapprehension. Okay, because development, you know, I said earlier that after 1914, the only kind of development, a successful development you could get was socialist. But there was something else that changed, and the reason why only socialism can develop these countries properly. Something else changed because, you know, Lenin said in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that by the early 20th century, the entire world had been divided up among the various big imperialist powers. And now only redivision was possible. Yeah, this is how he sees. Remember, Lenin is writing a year or so into the First World War. So First World War has already started. He's simply analyzing. He's not predicting anything. He's just analyzing what has happened. And he said, look, this is a war of redivision. Yeah, and that's what's happening. But in this sorry, where was I going with this? Yes. So there is a yes. So the new kind of the conditions in which all development must now take place, had to take place after 1914 is this. Every country that wishes to now develop must do so, number one, without the luxury of imperialism. First world countries developed on the backs of their colonies. No other country can now develop on the back of its colonies. This is a monumental fact. Whose peasantry are you going to exploit in order to develop? Because every form of development involves transferring resources from the agricultural economy, which is at one point in time the entire economy, to a newly created industrial sector. Lots of things have to go. Capital has to move, labor has to move. This remaining people in agriculture have to produce more food, more raw materials, etc. So the amount of work that has to be done by the agrarian sector in order to support industrialization is huge. Britain got the agrarian sectors of other countries to industrialize it. Yeah, this is not possible for any country, which is why in both the Soviet Union and in China, the initial phases of industrialization were connected with agrarian crises, right? The famine in Russia, and well, there were also agrarian difficulties in China with the Great Leap Forward. Although my friend Utsa Patnaik insists that there is no way that 30 million people died in it. That this is a totally exaggerated figure, but there's a wonderful little article by her, very short article in Monthly Review, a Monthly Review online, which I recommend to everybody. But anyway, there was an agrarian crisis. So that's the first thing, is it has to do it without the luxury of imperialism. Number two, it has to, all these countries have to develop from a starting point which is already set back by imperialism. That is, imperialism has pushed them back from the starting point, right, to a point which is further back. Retarded them, so they have to start from a lower starting point. And number three, they have to do it in the teeth of imperialist resistance. Yeah, so all of these three things mean that no country that will developed after 1914 could look like the development of the first world countries, the already developed countries. This is fundamentally different. So from that point of view, yes, the cost was heavy. Soviet Union had to pay a big cost, but not because of communism, but because that was the only kind of development that was possible. And of course, there is no guarantee that you will not make mistakes. Of course, mistakes were made. Yeah. So, but today in Russia, there is a big allergy to using the word socialism. And of course, so that's the first thing. Secondly, the reason, yes, secondly, Stalin is a figure that Stalin won the Second World War. Second World War was a life-changing experience for all the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's Russia's demographic structure is still suffering from the effects of the sheer number of people who died in that war. Remember that Russia lost 30 million people. The Soviet Union lost 30 million people. That's huge. That is more people than any country, many, many times more. I think I wrote down these figures recently, but I think that the British didn't lose more than a couple of million, and so on. So this is an enormous sacrifice that was made by Russia. And this is also interesting because, you know, in the big cataclysm of the 30 years crisis, because it was an imperialist crisis, the First World War. The First World War ended, but nothing was settled. The Versailles Settlement was no settlement, which is why you got the Second World War. So it's a single interconnected imperialist and capitalist crisis. And to resolve this, you needed socialist countries. Without the contribution of the Chinese and the Russians, there would have been no victory against fascism. There would not have been a victory against fascism. So think about that. It needed socialist countries to rescue the capitalist world from its own fascism. So the reason I'm saying all this is because that's why Stalin is such a towering figure in Russia. He won the Second World War. He was the leader, so he cannot really be attacked. So poor Lenin gets attacked as a form of attack on socialism. But you have to understand that Putin also, he may criticize Lenin in various ways and so on, but he also is known to have said that there was no greater geopolitical crisis than the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, that there was no greater international catastrophe than the end of the Soviet Union. And he's also quoted to have said that those who do not feel nostalgic about the Soviet Union and socialism have no heart, but those who want to bring it back have no head. So he has qualified it, but he does acknowledge that there was something there. Okay, and he's himself a product of that system. So that's, I don't know if I've answered it very well, but if I'll now go to the fascism question, and I have a very simple answer to this question. You know, for many years I taught a course on capitalism and democracy, and so I've sort of gone over this terrain year after year for more than a decade. So you know, there is this Western, sort of fond Western self-understanding that capitalism and liberal democracy go together. This is completely false. What you had in the 19th century and right up until the 1914 was essentially an authoritarian form of capitalism, right? I mean, you may have had some representative politics, but either the working class was not enfranchised, or, as in Germany, if it was enfranchised, it was to elect a parliament which itself did not have much power because the Kaiser had too much power. So you did not really have effective democracy. Then for a short period between, say, 1945 and the early 80s, you got some kind of a coexistence between liberal democracy and a highly reformed type of capitalism, with a welfare state, with an enormous amount of state regulation. And yes, that could have worked. But as soon as the underlying capitalism in it went into crisis, the road that was taken was, you know, that of neoliberalism, and which is to roll back these reforms more and more, not completely. Nobody could, because, you know, these reforms still had a lot of legitimacy. So, for example, in Britain, Mrs. Thatcher would have loved to simply abolish the National Health Service, but it still exists, at least in name. What they've done is hollow it out internally by, you know, corporatizing it and marketizing it and contracting it out and so on and so forth. But anyway, so they have rolled them back. And so what we have now is a relatively more naked form of capitalism, no longer reformed form of capitalism. And it is no wonder that we have seen the erosion of democracy in this time. So that's the first point. So there is no doubt that in all these countries democracy is eroded. It's come to the point where elected political leaders say that, you know, I will not do what is popular. Yeah, they take it as a point of pride, which is that, you know, they're not going, well, it's your function to do what's popular. That's what democracy is about, you know. It's not about standing, and then they call their service to capital standing up for principle.
Yeah, this is when they're, so, the idea that we should have independent central banks. What is an independent central bank? A central bank that's in the pocket of the big financial interests. It's not an independent central bank. So this idea that we should have independence from what? From popular desire, popular wishes and desires, that's anti-democratic. But that's how we are being sold lack of democracy. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is, what is fascism? Fascism is an attempt to organize authoritarianism in a context of mass enfranchisement. And it's no wonder that once you got effective mass enfranchisement in say, in a country like Germany, you got more or less fascism in short order. It is also very interesting, by the way, that, Eric Hobsbawm says, and I think he's right, that fascism was part of a larger resurgence of the right, in Europe at this time and in all the advanced industrial countries. There was a resurgence of the right, and the fascism was really the most sort of the worst or the sharp edge of the wedge, so to speak. But it is also interesting, especially when you remember that people like Cabral and others said, what was shocking about fascism was that they brought colonial practices into the heart of Europe. So, but there's another thing, which is, think about it. Fascism emerged, so the right-wing politics took the form of fascism in those countries that had the fewest or the least colonies. So that is also another interconnection between imperialism and fascism, right? Germany had just been deprived of her colonies. Italy never had very many to begin with. So this is also quite interesting, that because the imperialist countries had other ways of dealing with those kind of pressures. They could give more concessions to the working classes, etc., etc. So that's another thing. So today, and a third thing I want to say is that those of you, or let me rephrase that. When fascism was emerging, naturally, of course, leftist thinkers. All leftist thinkers were saying, what is going on? How are we to understand this? And they naturally connected it to the rise of monopoly capitalism and so on. And there's no doubt that the rise of monopoly capitalism makes capitalism more authoritarian to begin with. But I think that my definition, which is, organizing authoritarianism in the context of mass enfranchisement, because fascism always claims to be popular, it claims to be even socialist, right, national socialism, etc., because it needs to mobilize working people. And you see this, you can see that this had already begun to occur in the middle of the 19th century. If you read the 18th Brumaire, Marx there is discussing the activities of an outfit called the Society of December the 10th, which was instrumental in getting Louis Napoleon elected. And if you read Marx's descriptions of that society and its activities and its personnel and its character, you will be reminded of nothing more than the black shirts and the brown shirts of the 20th century. Yeah? So this is already there. And a final point I'll make is that fascism always involves mobilizing para-state violence, because the violence of the state is not enough to repress the capitalist class, repress working people generally. So you resort to supplementing state violence with the violence of your booths, your black shirts and your brown shirts. Okay, and that is kind of extrajudicial, etc., illegal, extrajudicial, etc. And finally, on the point of Modi, recently I was asked to write an article by some, interestingly, business professors. They are putting together a volume on corporations and fascism. And they asked me to write an article, and so I thought, what should I write about? And I decided that I would work on this, the parallels I had seen between the Modi government in India and its relation to the Indian corporate capitalist class today, and Hitler and his relations with the corporate capitalist class of Germany. And I ended up finding more parallels, to my great, trepidation and general fear, that there are far more parallels than you can imagine. So I've written this article, and if you like, I'll send around copies of it. It should be published very soon. So yeah, the parallels are enormous.
And so final point then, the key point here is that the corporate capitalist class resorts to a fascist entity in order to preserve its power when it feels that the existing parties can no longer help them to preserve it. It feels that. Whether this is objectively true or not, we don't know. So, but and of course, once you resort to such a power, you are also surrendering control to such a force, so that gives the fascist forces certain autonomies. Fascist forces can act against the interests of capital itself, because it is not the servant of capital. It has now become the master, right? And so it can endanger capitalism itself, as it endangered capitalism in Germany, right? By extending the war and so on and so forth. So in that sense, that and finally the resort to fascism does not resolve the crisis. It just opens a new chapter in the crisis of capitalism, which has led to the resort in the first place, because the fascist forces cannot resolve the crisis. We don't know what would have happened if Hitler had won the war, etc., etc. I mean, fascism in the classic form that we saw in Europe in the 20s and 30s had a short life. So we don't know what would happen if its life was extended. But today, I mean, fascism is a constant temptation. It's already taking form in various ways. Just Rockhill and I were just discussing, he rightly pointed out that Trump does not have the kind of parastate, he doesn't have his own society of goons yet. But as I pointed out to him, with this ICE and some one or two other police agencies, he's certainly creating a Praetorian Guard for himself. So that these are organizations capable of meting out violence that are under his command in a way that the American military is not yet. So, and there are, of course, there is reform in Britain, there is the AFD in Germany, so there are all sorts of such organizations already emerging in different capitalist countries. So that's what I would say.
Well, thank you very much. I'll ask one last question and then we'll open it up. So how do you understand the current state of US-led imperialism, the prospects for its decline, and the effects that this will have globally? And within this, you could also maybe talk about the specificities of Trump's policies, particularly concerning global trade and the status of the dollar.
So, to my mind, people started talking about multipolarity in the 2010s, after the 2008 financial crisis and so on. And generally speaking, when people talk about multipolarity, people generally refer to the fact that, China in particular is rising, and then to some extent, some other countries, India, although quite frankly, I think people are simply not aware just how much Modi is destroying the Indian economy. Modi is not. All these growth statistics are manufactured. So don't believe them. But even South Africa, Brazil, they're not doing as well, not by a long shot as China. But but there is China, and of course there is also, so now we've been mesmerized by the BRICS, but actually what we are now seeing is there's China, there's Russia, and then there are a number of other anti-systemic countries: Iran, Venezuela, North Korea. I think that these may possibly turn out to be far more important than the other BRICS countries, namely Brazil, South Africa, India, because Brazil, South Africa, India are still under the domination of a decaying corporate capitalist class, okay, as the United States. So people looked at the BRICS and said, these efforts to develop are creating multipolarity, but there's another development which is creating multipolarity, and that is the decline of capitalism, of the capitalist West. Capitalist West has been, if you take certain interpretations, has been in the current crisis for the last 50 years. Since the onset of the 1970s crisis, the stagflationary crisis of the 1970s, what happened is that all these capitalist countries said, we are going to take the neoliberal road out. 5 decades have passed. neoliberal policies have been applied. They have not succeeded in reviving capitalism in these countries. Capitalism is just winding down. It's getting deindustrialized. It's getting financialized. It's getting more and more unequal. Nothing is solving the problem. So, but neoliberal policies continue to be adhered to. Why? Because neoliberalism was never about free markets and competition. It was always about keeping, of securing the power and privileges of the corporate elite, of a monopoly capitalist class. Okay, and that's what it's doing. That's what it was designed to do. That's what it's doing. But of course, just because you preserve these people in power doesn't mean that they are going to be able to develop your economy, to increase the rate of investment, productive investment, to grow your economy. This is not happening. So everywhere you see fiscal crisis, because if your economy is not growing, and plus you're constantly giving tax breaks to rich people, where is the revenue going to come from? Today, the revenue crisis is acute. You have a big debt crisis in the United States. You have a slightly lesser debt crisis, but still far more serious debt crisis. In the UK, it's lesser in the sense that the debt of the UK is not that great because it can't be that great. We'll come back to that. So anyway, so there are everywhere there is fiscal crisis. So all of these societies are in a deep crisis, and they are going to, there is no sign that they're going to do anything other than dig themselves deeper into that crisis, because there is no left force. The only forces that are opposing the existing orders are right-wing forces, proto-fascistic or actually fascistic forces. I don't mind what you call it. You can call it something completely different, but it is that kind of force. So this is also advancing multipolarity. It is the inability of a enfeebled imperialism to impose its will. This is also clear militarily. As I was saying earlier, the United States did not win in its recent war against Iran. In the India-Pakistan standoff recently, there was this battle that took place. What happened? The reason you were a ceasefire is because it became very clear that Pakistan was able to down Western supplied jets, Indian Western supplied jets by Chinese supplied jets. Now this is pretty shocking if you think about it, especially if we, as Desai has pointed out, we are accustomed to thinking that, oh, these Chinese or these Russians will never be able to be as technologically superior. No, the Russians got hypersonic missiles back in 2018. I remember very well listening to the speech that Putin gave when he announced this. The West still doesn't have them. The West, I read somewhere, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I do read about these things. So I read somewhere that let me rephrase that. Madeleine Albright is supposed to have said, what's the point of having $1 trillion military if you don't use it? My question is, I will modify that question. What's the point of having $1 trillion military if it cannot win any wars for you? Yeah. So what you have in the US is a coddled military-industrial complex to whom more and more money is shoveled towards them. They accept this money, but they don't produce anything in return that's worth having, right? So you essentially have a technologically backward, as I say, coddled military-industrial complex. So I think the ability of the West to impose its will on the world is definitely on the wane. So now Trump. So to me, I have been arguing since the Trump's election and even before that Trump is not an actor in the, Trump got elected by saying, I'm going to resolve this crisis. Essentially, it's something quite interesting. Trump realized even back in 2016 and before that you can't win a US election by telling people in the United States that their economy is doing very well. Because the people knew that that was not true. They could feel it in their own life, in their own experiences, in their own bank accounts and pocketbooks and so on. So Trump said to them, your economy is doing very badly. But of course, Trump is there to serve the same corporate capitalist class as Biden is there to serve and Hillary Clinton is there to serve and so on. So then he has to accompany this truth with a different lie. right? Not the same lie, but a different lie. So the lie he told Americans is that their plight is because of immigrants and because of China and because of trade. When in fact the truth is that their plight is because of 4.5+ decades of neoliberal policies, right? But he couldn't tell them that because he's going to continue neoliberal policies. So he got elected. Now, so he's now elected, and he got elected saying, I'm going to resolve the crisis, but he's not going to resolve the crisis because he's not an actor in this crisis. He is a symptom of the crisis. Think about it. How much has to go wrong in an allegedly prosperous society for them to elect charlatans like Trump, or for that matter, the British elected Boris Johnson? I mean, these are jokers. But they get elected because they know how to, because the more established and staid capitalist elite is out of tricks. So he's pulled out a new one out of his hat, and so he's, so anyway, so he will be buffeted about. So what are these tariffs about? These tariffs are basically about the fact that he has promised Americans that he's going to do something on trade. So he wants to, every other week there was some new tariff being announced and so on. And then there's this whole taco phenomenon. Trump always chickens out because there are always these two logics, right? The logic of what Habermas calls the logic of accumulation and the logic of legitimation, or some other writer called the politics of power and the politics of support. So these two have always to be reconciled by any capitalist politician. So, and it's a bit like riding two horses, except that it's all right if the two horses are going in the same direction, but if the two horses start going in opposite directions, then you've got a serious problem. And that's the kind of problem Trump is in, because his support base requires that he has, he enact tariffs which his capitalist cronies don't want him to. His support base requires that he has some welfarist policies in place, because at the end of the day now the Republican Party is the home of a considerable section of the American working class, and they rely on certain elements of the welfare state. His big beautiful bill has taken them away. So it's not surprising that there are splits in MAGA. But so Trump will be buffeted about. And he will always try to look as if he has, whatever, he will allow things to unfold, and then whatever happens that seems to have worked, he said, I did it. And he will take credit for it, and that's how he will complete his term. But of course, underlying this, the situation will keep getting worse for the United States, because essentially what he's done in the case of tariffs is he has simply increased the level of uncertainty to such an extent that, barring Mexico and Canada, which unfortunately hitched their wagon to the American horse 3 or 4 decades ago, they are not going to unhitch it very easily. So they are going to have to kowtow to the Americans, but everybody else is going to essentially say, look, trading with the Americans, having economic relationship with the Americans is just too much trouble. And we are going to try and diversify away from the United States. And here's a statistic which is quite interesting. Around the time when this tariff storm erupted, April 2nd, I guess, I was looking up the statistics. What proportion of world imports does the US account for? And depending on how you count it, it's somewhere between 10 and 16%. These are different figures, but different people count it different ways. It's not a small figure, but it's not huge either. We've already seen that compared to the 2016, when Trump was first elected, and his trade war with China at that time, China has already reduced its reliance on trade with the United States quite massively. So China will of course suffer a little bit. China will do what it can to, moderate whatever shock it gets, but it's not going to suffer too much from the shock that Trump will deliver. A lot of the time China may seem like, it's kind of trying to say we should not do this, we should not have tariffs, and that somehow it's trying to save itself. No, what China is doing is expressing a different world vision. And I think China, the Beijing consensus, if we want to call it that, will eventually win over the Washington consensus. So the rest of the world will simply start disengaging from the United States. That will be the thing. As far as the dollar is concerned, I mean, do you want me to answer the question about the dollar? Well, let me just give you a very brief account. So my argument has been that the dollar never served the world as world money stably. It was already in trouble by 1958 in the pre-71 version. And then the entire decade of the 60s was spent trying to exhausting one expedient after another, one option after another, to keep the dollar's gold link. And when all of these options were exhausted, the gold link was broken. And then people say, well, thereafter, look at, isn't it amazing the dollar system has continued to work, blah, blah, etc. No, it has not continued to work. What appears to be an even dollar hegemony, if one may call it that, has actually been based on a series of what I call financializations, vast expansions of financial activity. Because remember, the original problem with the dollar was that you can't supply the world with liquidity by running deficits. Sterling system worked because Britain did not need to run deficits, because Britain could export colonial surpluses as capital. America had no colonial surpluses to export as capital, so it provided liquidity to the world with deficits. And the problem with that was, the bigger your deficits, the less attractive your dollar, which puts downward pressure on the dollar. So after 71, you had required vast expansions of purely financial activity, so that the resulting demand for the dollar puts upward pressure on the dollar, counteracting the downward pressure which is created by the US's deficits. Okay, fiscal deficit, current account deficit, or both deficits. So these financializations are now, however, exhausted. Because you see, in 2008 was the high point. 2008 was the highest level of money coming into the US system. Most of this money, people call the 2008 financial crisis the global financial crisis. There was nothing global about that financial crisis. It was a North Atlantic financial crisis. Yeah, because outside the United States, the countries that were most invested in the dollar system, even the Canadians didn't invest, interestingly. But British invested, and the Eurozone financial institutions invested in the dollar system. And they were the ones who were the most hurt by it, by the bust. After that, once bitten, twice shy, the amount of money flowing into the dollar system still remains too low. And without this money flowing in, the downward pressure is not counteracted, which is why the dollar is declining. Now the Federal Reserve, and I should add that, again, I mentioned Utsa Patnaik already, Prabhat and Utsa emphasize another element of the dollar stability, which is to prevent the rest of the world from developing. Because what does that do? It reduces the demand for primary commodities. Because imagine, if the whole world develops, the prices of all primary commodities whose supply is not readily extendable, copper, or iron ore, oil, were all industrial goods, food, everything will go up, because these countries will demand more of those things, and the supply is not elastic. So they emphasize that. So now I feel that I can bring together these two things. So there's not enough money flowing into the dollar system. Meanwhile, inflation is rising. Now, and I'm nearly done. What is rising? This puts the Federal Reserve, essentially the Federal Reserve is being squeezed by a pincer of these two movements. Why is it a pincer? Because in order to preserve the value of the dollar, the Federal Reserve must deal with inflation. But the only way it can deal with inflation, the only way it will permit itself to deal with inflation, is by raising interest rates. But for the last 2.5 decades, the Federal Reserve has brought money into the system by running an easy money policy. The moment the easy money policy is stopped, you are in danger of pricking the bubble. That's what happened last time. The Federal Reserve in 2004 or 5 was forced to start raising interest rates because the value of the dollar was declining. They raised interest rates steadily, quarter percentage point at a time. And when it reached about 5.25%, the
the bubble, housing and credit bubbles were pricked. And then you got the big disaster of 2008. Now we are at 5.25%. Now the inflation still remains high, but Powell says not, he's not going to raise them further, higher for longer maybe, but not go further up. Because in a certain sense, you already started seeing the pricking of the bubble with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, etc., etc. So in a certain sense, that collapse has already started, and we'll see a slow motion version of it. So anyway, they can't do that. So they can't prick the bubble. On the other hand, then if they tolerate inflation, inflation will eat away the value of the dollar. So one way or the other, it's going to. And of course, all Trump's antics are not going to help it survive. They're only endangering it more. With his attacks on the Federal Reserve's independence, etc., all of this is going to. And that's another reason why Trump is a symptom of the crisis, because the US ruling classes, their options are narrowing. And they are choosing within an ever-narrowing range of options. That's what's going on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now we're going to open it up to questions. I'm sure there's many. I already see some hands up. Lots of questions. Yeah, we'll take a few.
Yeah.
3 or 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think every whole room.
Seema, maybe we could privilege the people who haven't asked questions.
Yeah, maybe people who haven't asked questions yet.
I think Jesse had, well.
Oh, yeah, I'll go.
Oh, yeah, just people who haven't yet.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you, first of all, for this super interesting talk. I just wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit on the role of sanctions in the geopolitical world economy, and also efforts that have been made by, for example, the BRICS countries to set up alternative systems to get around that and contribute to this rise of multipolarity.
Just so you know, too, we're going to do a round on the line afterwards. So unfortunately, we're going to have to condense.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me through the? So I've also, of course, been trained to believe that, the inner contradictions and the crises that capitalism creates and are sort of inherent to it are sources of vulnerability. But I've been reading more about just, of course, the ways in which, in different ways, but they'll say crises. It's used by capitalism actually as this sort of like regenerative power, right, in time. And so that, in fact, rather than being really vulnerable moments, they end up being times where capitalism finds like deeper ways of kind of digging into society. So I'm curious if you find that to be true. What does that mean in terms of how do we think about crises and how to take advantage of those moments? And then actually now this question of like, irregardless of whether China is like socialist or capitalist or whatever, it's like, are they saving capitalism?
Thank you so much for what I think is a really incredibly sharp analysis. I really would like you to expand on something that caught my attention, which was your brief comments about Angela Merkel and really how you conceptualize her as an obstacle to the European Union's conflict with Russia. And also kind of related to that, really how the European Union transformed from initial reluctance to wage this proxy in Ukraine against Russia to now very enthusiastically militarizing themselves. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the comments. I was wondering if you could say some more about maybe the Sahel region and developments there in Burkina Faso, and if we are seeing these movements now being more successful because of maybe an overextension of imperialism, or how else maybe we could understand that. Thank you.
Should I introduce a round of answers?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll just go in the order that you asked. So your question on role of sanctions. So, yeah, I have an unwritten paper on sanctions, so I have not written it. But if I were to write it, I'd say something like the following. Like I've got a draft, but I didn't finish it. So here's the thing. There's a huge literature on sanctions. And typically the literature on sanctions is, there's one stream talks about the effects of sanctions, which are indeed very destructive. So don't get me wrong, like the sanctions take lives. They have taken lives in Iraq, in Venezuela, in Cuba, elsewhere. So they are very bad. But then there is another literature on the effectiveness of sanctions, because if you think about it, sanctions are basically imposed in order to change the behavior of your target country. But in practically no instance of the imposition of sanctions has the behavior of that country actually changed. Not in Venezuela, not in Iran, not in North Korea, not anywhere. And in the case of Russia, what we've seen is, of course, the boomeranging of sanctions. Russia has today developed a much more diversified economy. The early sanctions, which were agricultural, have actually made Russia into something of an agricultural superpower. Where Russian exports of grain are becoming increasingly important in world trade. So in that sense, sanctions are not working. So why do you keep imposing sanctions? I think it's a form of impotence of the West, because you really don't have the capacity to fight wars. Remember also that, after Vietnam, the draft has never been imposed. The US will never go back to the draft. It's not possible. If you look today, American parents don't even let their children walk to school. You think they're going to let their children go to war? This is ridiculous. So there is no willingness to fight, and quite frankly, this is just as it should be, because the willingness of a country, of the people of a country that is under attack to fight is always greater than the willingness of the people of a country which is fighting imperialist wars to fight. They're not going to fight. I mean, the end of the day, working people will say, well, why do we need to do that? We're fine. We don't need to go and conquer some other country. So to come back, so they can't fight. They don't have the manpower, and because they don't have or human power, they have of course been fighting more and more what I call capital intensive wars. You bomb people, from afar. You use drones and bombs and so on from afar, but that has not been particularly effective in imposing your control over any territory. You can't even hold Afghanistan. Well, what else? What are you going to do? I mean, it's not like the Afghans had some great superpower or anything, but they simply fought until the Americans had to leave, right? So in this sense, sanctions are, to me, just a form of impotence. They don't work, but it's like I don't know quite how to put it. I hope I'm not being insulting to anybody, but like, the image one has of shamans, sort of acting as if they are performing, going through some sort of ritual in order to show that they are actually addressing some problem, but no problem is being addressed by them, and if anything, your adversaries are becoming stronger. I mean, take Cuba, North Korea. These countries have survived sanctions for decades, right? Anyway, okay. So and the weaponization of the dollar, of course, has been particularly important. It's interesting, that the world only stood up and took notice when the dollar was weaponized against Russia, which is, after all, a permanent member of the Security Council, a very powerful country, etc. But previously, the dollar was weaponized. Just a few months before, we learned about how the dollar was, the United States was sitting on billions of dollars worth of Afghan money while, children in Afghanistan were starving, etc. So, these kinds of things have been done against Afghanistan, against Iran, against Venezuela, and so on. On the alternatives that the BRICS are creating, my line is that they are not getting very far. Recently I studied a very fine report that the Russians published just before the Kazan summit. And they identified all the key problems with the existing dollar system, nearly all the key problems. But still, they did not propose a solution, because I think any serious solution will require that all these capitalist countries detach their elites from their addiction to the US dollar system, because the elites of these countries, perhaps not so much of Russia today, and certainly not of China, but certainly of India or South Africa, of Brazil, they are all invested in the dollar system. That's where they park their ill-gotten gains. So unless you deal with the power of these elites, you will not be able to impose capital controls, without which you will not get a solution, a reliable alternative to the dollar system. So capital controls they must be imposed, no matter how much, and this will also require a big change of heart on the part of the intellectuals of all these classes, because they are today the repositories of globalism. That is where globalism resides, is in the intellectual classes, because they just love their international lifestyles, I travel here, there, and everywhere, and I can do whatever I like, and so on. So this is very key. Okay, so that's my answer to your question. Crisis and opportunity, your question really crystallized in my mind the unease I've always felt with the idea of disaster capitalism, which is the book of Naomi Klein, I believe. I mean, she's very smart and she's very committed, and I don't want to... but you see, of course, every time there's a disaster, some people are going to make money. Yeah, if there is an earthquake, if there's a whatever, some people will go and loot shops, and others will, funnel away money from relief efforts and so on. This will, of course, always happen. But that does not mean that the system as a whole is not unraveling. Yeah, is not exhausting its options. So to me, yes, of course, every crisis is an opportunity, but not in that way. Do you see? I was just saying to some Chinese friends, I was reminding them of Mao's, because I was saying to them that, compared to the rest of the world where everything is going pear-shaped, China is this ocean of stability, when you go there. Like most people in China can't imagine how every morning you wake up and hear some news of some new disaster that is hitting Western countries, right? And of course, poor countries even worse. So everything is spiraling out of control in the West, but in China, it's like an ocean of stability. And I said that what's happening in the West reminds one of Mao's old saying that, there is chaos under the heavens, but the situation is excellent. Meaning that it is an opportunity for us, for left-wing people. It's not an opportunity for capitalists. The crisis of capitalism should be an opportunity for the left, and we should take it with both hands. But unfortunately, we're not yet as fully organized as we should be, but things are changing. You've got your Zoran Mamdani, and you've got your Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn, and you've got, anyway, there are various new left forces emerging. Anyway, so that's my answer to, and is China saving capitalism? Well, unfortunately, until socialism prevails, I have already said that China and Russia saved capitalism once. They may, unfortunately, have to do it again. For the simple reason that, even a malfunctioning capitalist economy is still a way for many people to make their living. Millions of people to make their living. You can't just destroy it. This idea that, I'm trying to find the right words for this. If a company is not functioning, you can shut it down. But if a country is not functioning, you can't shut it down. You've got to make it work somehow. Yeah, because there are people involved. You can shut down a company because you assume that everybody who was involved in that company will find some other occupation. But that you can't assume that about a country. So they may have to save capitalism in some form or another a few more times before we finally get to socialism. About Merkel and the militarization of the EU, I see. Merkel remains a mystery, but it's like
So, and she was actually pretty effective as a chancellor. What she did, however, the mistake she made was this or she's alleged to have made, we will accept refugees. Quite frankly, there was nothing wrong with that. Because given that in Western countries, essentially, you have created a society in which it's too expensive to have babies, you're going to have to import your workers from somewhere. She saw an opportunity in Syria, she took it with both hands. What she didn't do is she did not give communities in Germany the means to cope with the influx. And this has led to some bad blood, etc. But anyway, I just want to say, I thought she was a pretty effective leader. I think she could see very clearly that the future of German industry lay in having access to cheap energy from Russia. And she was very, and that's why she did what she did. Yes, I mean, yeah. So, and I would say that she's today being vilified up and down the German press, and she's supposed to have given that interview in which she said that we were pulling wool over Russians' eyes. We were pretending to negotiate with Russia while actually giving Ukraine time. I actually read that interview. I read German, and I also asked my German-speaking friends to confirm my interpretation. So in this interview, she says at one point, Ukraine needed more time to join the EU. That was the question. Ukraine needed more time. We should say that Ukraine was not ready to join the EU at that point, which is actually a negative thing to say about Ukraine. Then a few paragraphs later, a few other interventions later, she said, and then Ukraine used this time to arm itself. That's not the same thing as saying we knew what Ukraine was doing. What's interesting to me, she's not come out and defended herself. And now she's come out with this autobiography, which I haven't read, by the way, so I'm sorry. But I have read reviews of it. And so she's clearly and they're quite hostile reviews because the establishment in the West does not like her anymore. They liked her when she stood up against Trump. There's that famous poster of her standing like this and Trump sort of sitting and looking, being lectured by her. But anyway, so the thing is that I think that she represented that kind of a sane German capitalism. And now you have some insane German capitalism in power. And I think that what's interesting about many of these people who are leaders in various European capitals today is a number of them who have been in one sense or another part of American-led financial capitalism. They have worked, this guy works for Blackwater, and our Canadian Prime Minister Carney used to work for some other Wall Street company. Anyway, so this is kind of quite interesting, and they are sort of doing the bidding of an extremely extremely aggressive financial American capitalism, which is living in fantasy land, as financial capitalists generally do. So that would be, and the militarization of the EU, as I said, it is going to be a disaster. And quite frankly, I don't think it will be possible. They don't have the fiscal resources to do it. And I don't even think that I just don't think they will be able to manage it. And then finally on the Sahel region, I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer to your question because I've not been examining the situation in any grainy detail at all. But overall, I can say that the reason why you've been seeing this is that, of course, the whole institution of the CFR has been a way, the franc region that they had there has been a way of essentially continuing colonialism. So what you are seeing is an anti-colonial uprising. And this is taking place at a time when even the minor concessions that were once possible, on the part of the French, etc. I mean, the situation has reached a crunch point where that system cannot be, it has become intolerable. Even more, like it was already bad, but it's become intolerable, and this is the result. The Sahel outbreaks are the result of that. And I would say a lot of different things are happening. It's not just the fact that the existence of the French. The European Union more generally is removing the options for these economies. So, European corporate capital is, yeah.
Wonderful. I think there's a round online.
Yeah, do we want to start with Joe? I think had his hand up first.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Desai. And I would like to talk about development of production forces And building on your point of Western development was based on colonialism, and that the only possible development for the global South, constrained by the lack of possibility to act through plunder as well, and the existing limitations to the past and current imperialism. So I would like to understand your position at an international level if the Chinese model of development of the production forces, how does it create a new dynamic to the global South? Because as I think Gabriel had asked about the Chinese, so-called Chinese imperialism, does this development create an entire new shift towards weakening imperialism and imposing some relative peace due to the development? Yeah, thank you.
I think we can then do Gabriella, then Aminta.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Professor Radhika. It was very interesting, your talk. I am very interested in the category of fascism itself and its current manifestations. For example, sometimes you see a lot of resistance in academia and even from the so-called left to apply the theory of fascism to describe the US under Trump 2.0. So my question is whether you think that the category of fascism correctly describes the current Trump administration. And my second question is kind of related to that, considering the current manifestations of fascism. What do you think is like a role of China and Russia in the fight against contemporary fascism? Thank you.
And Aminta, you can go.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
First of all, thank you so much, Professor, for your talk today. I don't know if you remember me, but we actually spoke on a panel together in Venezuela about 4 years ago. So
Great, wonderful. You do look familiar, yes.
Yeah, so it's great to just share a space with you again. I had a question. I wanted to know your thoughts on how should we make sense of the deglobalization, or what some have even titled regionalized globalization, that the United States has been pushing to advance its trade war with China and to another extent the EU, especially as we observe this transformation of imperialism or global governance, whereby the United States has essentially rewritten the global rules through its sanctions program, first against Iran, then against Iran-affiliated global banks and businesses, and finally against the daily compliance practices of global money, information, and technology flows in general. How should we make sense of the sustained legal uncertainty over these jurisdictional limits of hegemonic power? Thank you.
15 minutes and they're going to kick us out. Just
Okay, sure, all right. Well, I will just, you just asked me to stop. But I'll do my best to try and answer these questions. So on the first question of the development of the forces of production and the Chinese model, I mean, basically, I would say that I think that what China is trying to do in the rest of the world, and it's not again without problems. You know, China, for example, went on a big lending spree in the 2010s, and then it found that many of the countries to which it was lending were unable to pay it back. Now, it hasn't acted like the West, you know, imposing structural adjustment and so on. It has tried to negotiate in good faith to, you know, for long-term repayment of the debt. It lent on originally on good conditions as well. So China has been, generally speaking, a good creditor. But having said that, I mean, if you're all don't throw good money after bad, sort of thing. You know, what you lend is already in trouble. So there are limits to China's ability to lend, in the sense that there are not enough governments which are like itself, which are capable of developing their economies. So what China can do in that sort of world will be limited. So what we need more and more is for various forces, for there to be governments in these other countries which are at least capable of realizing that capitalism is no longer working, that we have to take leaves out of China's book and so on, and we need to make, and remember, this requires an enormous amount of social consent and social cohesion. It's not just, capitalism may not require much, but socialism does. So you have to create that will and desire for socialism, and the understanding that it's going to be a hard slog. And politicians generally are not capable of, promising a hard slog. They would rather promise you an easy life. So, but unfortunately, promises of easy life are not leading anywhere good. So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, however, I think that the Chinese are trying to, they are sharing technology. They are, for example, take DeepSeek. DeepSeek is open source. Anybody can use it. They are not governed by a private property system, a proprietorial regime of intellectual property rights, etc. They are quite happy to share their technology with the world, and I think this can only help the rest of the world. And there is no doubt in my mind that what they are trying to do is precisely create a new type of global governance which is focused precisely on peace and development. So, but of course its ability to do this will be limited by the extent to which the West continues to throw spanners in the works of this effort. On fascism, I agree that many on the left don't want to apply the term fascism to anything happening today. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the Trump phenomenon, is a little bit odd in the sense that, Trump doesn't have, as I say, his own organization of goons, although there are the Proud Boys and whatever. There are some such organizations, but they don't seem to be. But the point is that, to me, the situation is still resembles fascism. And I would say that in this, I would even call the Biden gang, the Democrats, to be to some extent fascist, because they are quite authoritarian. They have been quite authoritarian, and they have been using all sorts of forces against essentially popular forms of power. But anyway, I would say that fascism doesn't have to. Fascism refers to how, refers to the difficulty of maintaining democracy in capitalist conditions. And I think in that sense, you can always have fascism. China and Russia versus, I think you said contemporary fascism, am I right? China, yeah. How will they help fight fascism? Well, I think that they will help fight fascism primarily by aiding forces of the left. That's the only way that they can fight fascism. I mean, there are no fascist forces that I can think of in China. So it's not a question of fighting fascist forces in China. I don't think there are fascist forces in Russia. So what I would say is that the objective imperatives that they face can only aid left forces. And I think that insofar as they aid left forces, progressive forces in the rest of the world, that will be a good thing. Although, yeah, so I mean, I'll leave it at that. I think it's a little bit complicated. For example, when you see, when I see that, well, China or Russia for that matter, having to at least humor Modi, this is a bit problematic, but then that's the way things are. It's not going to be an easy path to fighting fascism as well. Deglobalization, regionalism. There I would, I think this is a very important question. A lot of what passed for globalization was actually regionalization, in the sense that you got, you got the European Union, you had NAFTA, you have ASEAN, you have all these regional groupings, and these regional groupings make sense because the development of technology as we have experienced it so far requires large-scale production, and large-scale production requires large markets, large labor forces, large
etc. Large catchment areas, hinterlands, and so on. So, in that sense, I think that regionalism is the way to go. Of course, what Trump is doing is harking back to the days of the Monroe Doctrine and so on and so forth. But I think that, you know, as the power of imperialist countries wanes, regionalism can be more cooperative, more democratic, more equal, more, and that would be a good thing. And then, yes, US sanctions are certainly violating its own, the global governance system that it itself created, and that shows you the extent to which US power has waned, that it has to undermine the very institutions that the US itself has created. As far as the, you know, the other stuff you are referring to, the compliance practices, I know from many conversations with Venezuelan friends and colleagues that this is of a particular concern, because what happens when the US imposes sanctions, particularly extraterritorial sanctions, that is to say the US claims the right to prosecute companies in other countries which may be having trade relations with those countries, as you get over compliance, that is to say people fear that the US will do this, that, or the other, and then that means that they will not engage in relations that will be perfectly legal even under the US sanctions regime. This kind of thing, I would say, will probably go down in the sense that as US power wanes, then there is less to fear, basically. So that would be my answer to your question. I think I was with it there.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, there's 8 minutes left, so I don't know if we want to take a last question or if it would be better to wrap up. Does anyone have a last quick question, maybe in the room? Yeah.
So, well, thank you for all your input. I have a quick question on the definition of fascism. Coming from the Dimitrov thesis that he stated in 1935, where he basically said fascism is the most chauvinistic and terroristic dictatorship of financial capital. And when you said that financial capital or big corporations are surrendering control to fascist powers, I was wondering how this relation looks like. Are they really surrendering power? And in how far fascist forces still act on behalf of financial capital? So,
sure, that's a really great question, and it actually. So, you know, basically, a lot of the left analysis of fascism was produced in the 20s and 30s. So you are quoting. So this is why the phenomena was still relatively new. It hadn't quite met its end, and so on. And then many decades later, Poulantzas wrote this very fine book, Fascism and Dictatorship. And in that, he pointed out that, let me see, right. Well, anyway, I don't want to go into Poulantzas so much. I want to make another point. But basically what I want to say is that what's become clear in light of subsequent research, what really happened under fascism, is precisely that, okay, Dimitrov uses the term the dictatorship of finance capital. You know, the way in which the word finance capital was used at that time is not the same as today's financial capital, right? What Hilferding was talking about when he used the term finance capital was he basically talked about a form of bank-industry relations in which banks further the power of productive capital, increase productive investment. What we have today is the opposite, where banks strangle that. But anyway, so that it was really no different from monopoly capitalism, right? So it was definitely a form of monopoly capitalism seeking to impose its will on the country, right? But the fact that in order to do so, it cannot rely on any mainstream party, but this upstart party, which has become elected or which is able to mobilize people by giving them false promises, which it must, at some level, in order to stay in power,
at least appear to fulfill, means that there will be this divergence. Remember I talked about the two horses going in different directions. This divergence will be there. And that's why in a very fine review of Poulantzas' book, Jane Kaplan pointed out that his book is very good at various levels, but it misses one point, which is that he seems to think that fascism resolved the problems of capitalism. But no, it's fascism only becomes another stage in the problems, in the crisis of capitalism. And so that's the understanding that I have used. Now, you asked for a definition of fascism. So so to me, definition of fascism is that you have, is the one I gave. How do you organize, how do you reassert the power of capital in the context of mass democracy where it has been endangered, where it has lost legitimacy? So that, to me, so mass democracy is very critically important. Mass enfranchisement is pretty important. And then in order to do this, it seems to me that one of the essentials of fascism is the organization of this parastate force. It's true, yes, fascism is unconstitutional, but fascism also organizes this parastate force. To me, that's essential because of the extra repression that will be necessary in order to assert capitalist control in this context. So I look for that, although, that's the definition I have based on current developments we have seen so far. And we see that, there are, for example, in the classic Indian case, you have a very, very large organization of parastate forces which regularly inflicts parastate violence in people in India. So we definitely have that there.
No, I think that we just need to wrap up. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.